Miss Hawthorne will keep her rooms after the wedding, Lysander said. Florence drew the cream dance card from her bouquet and struck his name from the first line with the little silver pencil. She turned from the Duke, placed a gloved hand in Everett's, and said, "Then I choose your brother to take me away from this altar." Everett did not step into the groom's place. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and asked, "As escort only, yes." The clergyman froze. Guests stared. At the chapel's edge, the woman in burgundy had gone pale. 3 days earlier, servants had carried fresh linen into the East Wing rooms under Lysander's orders. "It is a private arrangement," Lysander murmured. "A quiet one. You are sensible, Florence. I expect my Duchess to be civilized." Florence knew what he meant. For 6 years she had kept her widowed aunt's household comfortable by noticing trouble before others did. Lysander expected that skill turned upon his marriage, she would smooth his reputation. Make room for another woman and call her own humiliation. Good breeding. She closed the card around the pencil. The ceremony is over. Everett offered his arm. The side door would be quicker. The main aisle. I will not leave as though I have done something shameful. His mouth almost curved. He let the joke die. The main aisle, then. They had taken 6 steps when Lysander called after them. "Do not pity her. She arranged this with my brother before the settlements were drawn." Florence stopped. Everett stopped with her but did not turn first. She looked back. "If anyone tells the story of this morning, your grace let him begin with the fact that I spoke no vow." Then she faced the doors. "Now we may go, Lord Brackenfell." The carriage door shut with a hard click. Her family had already left. By noon, County Wicklow would decide whether she was a jealous fool or a schemer who had traded one brother for another. To Brackenfell, Everett said, when she asked where they were going, "My great-aunt occupies the Dowager's wing. It is the most respectable corridor in Ireland." The abandoned wedding breakfast was still laid when they arrived. Guests had split into whispering camps. An elderly widow could not find her driver. 2 gentlemen were nearing a quarrel. Florence found the widow's cloak and sent a footman to the west stables. Everett diverted the quarrel with an extravagant opinion about mustard. Florence noticed people. Everett noticed the room. Between them, the breakfast began to behave like a gathering again. When the last stranded guest had a carriage, Everett glanced at the crossed-out dance card in Florence's hand. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I should like to discuss 3 gatherings, 5 troublesome weeks, and wages." Florence looked at him. Wages, not matrimony," he said. "I have learned not to confuse the two." The next morning, Florence sat in the Dowager's morning room in a plain blue day dress. Lady Margaret Brackenfell had breakfasted with her and made it clear that respectable supervision need not feel like imprisonment. The cream wedding silk had been packed away. A note from Florence's aunt lay unopened beside her cup. The departing carriage had already said enough. The alliance was lost, and Florence must make her own arrangements. Everett entered carrying a leather-bound household book. He stopped on the far side of the table rather than taking the chair beside her. "I have a proposition," he said. "Brackenfell is committed to 3 gatherings over the next 5 weeks. A supper, a music evening, and the county ball. The kitchens have ordered for them, musicians have been engaged, and half the county is presently deciding whether attendance would suggest moral weakness. After yesterday, half will send regrets." "Precisely. If I cancel, every tradesman connected with the season bears part of my brother's scandal. If I proceed badly, they bear it anyway." He set the book before her. Lists of carriages, wine, linen, musicians, and guests filled the pages. Florence saw at once that the supper arrivals were too close together, and 3 elderly guests had been assigned the eastern stair. Everett saw her looking. "You reorganized a ruined wedding breakfast while wearing a veil," he said. "I should like to employ you for the season." Florence lifted her eyes. "Employ me as what?" "As the person who prevents me from seating deaf men beside fireplaces and starting wars over fish. That is not a recognized household office." "No." But incompetence is widely recognized, and I possess enough of it to justify innovation. She almost smiled, then stopped herself. If I accept money from you, the county will say yesterday was arranged. The county already says it. Refusing wages will not make its imagination poorer. That struck harder than comfort would have. Florence looked again at the household book. She had spent years doing such work because a useful, unmarried niece was expected to be grateful for her place. She had once believed marriage would turn usefulness into security. Yesterday had shown her what kind of security Lysander meant to purchase with it. "What are the terms?" she asked. Everett's expression changed. Less brightness, more attention. Wages paid weekly through my steward. My great-aunt remains in residence. You may leave after any gathering with every shilling already earned. You direct seating, household timing, carriages, supper order, and the comfort of the guests. I retain invitations and the receiving of anyone who believes a title permits bad manners. And if I leave after the first supper, you leave. If I refuse to dance with you, I attempt to survive the disappointment. If I refuse anything else, his answer came without ornament. These wages purchase your work, nothing more. Florence rested 2 fingers on the page. These were not promises about his character. They were work wages, duties, and a door she could still use. I will need a small sitting room near the service passage, she said. Not in the drawing-room wing. The footman must be able to find me without crossing half the house. Everett sat back. Done. I want the current regrets, not yesterday's guest list. Done. And no one changes a place card after I set the final table without telling me first. That provision appears designed specifically to wound me. It is designed specifically to prevent you. His grin arrived bright and unrepentant. Miss Ingram, I begin to understand why my brother failed to appreciate you. He dislikes terms he did not write. Florence closed the household book. Then it is fortunate I am not working for him. By noon, a narrow sitting room beside the service corridor held her lists, pencils, and bell pull. Her first week's wages were entered by the steward before she lifted a single place card. Florence looked at the neat sum longer than she meant to. No ring, no settlement, no promise of affection. Payment for work she already knew how to do. She folded the receipt and put it beneath the cream dance card in her writing case. By the time the first formal supper arrived later that week, Florence was tired in a way she trusted. The weariness came from decisions that belonged to her. She stood in the service corridor with a folded guest list in one hand. Lord Penhaligon, who heard poorly on his left side, had been moved so conversation would reach his good ear. A nervous young lady had been placed 2 seats from the matron, most likely to ask about the chapel. An elderly widow's chair had been exchanged for one with a firmer back before the doors opened. The steward approached with a worried expression. Lord Merriweather has arrived with his cousin. The cousin was not expected. Florence looked at the table plan. 24 places. 25 guests. Set another place beside Mrs. Vale. She likes strangers and dislikes silence. Move the flowers 6 inches inward. No one will know. A low voice behind her said, I knew there was a reason I hired a tyrant. Everett had come through the side door rather than summoning her to the drawing-room. He was already dressed to receive his cravat immaculate, his expression entirely too pleased with the emergency. You hired someone to prevent emergencies from becoming entertainment, Florence said. Then I must find entertainment elsewhere. You might begin by keeping Lord Derby from discussing the altar before the soup. An easier task than the cousin. He went. Florence watched from the doorway as Everett received the guests. She had expected the charm of a rake to narrow when there was no pretty woman to impress. It did not. He bent his head so Lord Penhaligon could hear him. He remembered that Mrs. Vale's son had returned from Bath. When a footman nearly dropped a tray after being addressed sharply by a guest, Everett caught the guest's attention with a ridiculous question about hunting boots, and gave the boy time to recover without anyone naming the mistake. Then Lord Derby predictably said, I confess, Brackenfell, I wondered whether Miss Ingram would show her face so soon. Everett's smile did not harden. That was what Florence noticed. "My dear Derby," he said, "if I stayed home every time my family embarrassed me, you would have been deprived of my company since infancy." Derby laughed. The question dissolved without Florence becoming the joke. Something warm and inconvenient moved beneath her ribs. Later during supper, the second violinist drifted so painfully out of tune that 3 guests winced at once. Florence caught Everett's eye and tapped one finger against her wrist end the music before the next course. He understood. Everett rose with his glass. "Our musicians have labored heroically. If they continue, I fear we shall be forced to admire them instead of the pudding, and no household should require such a sacrifice." The guests laughed. The players stopped without public disgrace. Florence signaled the footman, and the next course appeared into the opening Everett had made. That was their first real rhythm. Florence saw the discomfort of one person before it became visible. Everett saw when an entire room was about to turn cruel, dull, or awkward. Neither skill replaced the other. After the guests had gone, Everett appeared in the service corridor holding the amended place list. "You changed 4 seats." "5. I found only 4. Then my work is better than yours." He studied the paper as if personally affronted. "That is a dangerous thing to say to a man with authority over the invitations." Florence took the list from him. "And a dangerous thing to say to a woman with authority over where you sit." For one suspended second, he looked not amused, but delighted. Florence carried the list into her little sitting room before he could see that she was smiling. As the weeks passed, Brackenfell stopped feeling like a house under siege. The kitchens returned to arguing about sauces instead of scandal. Carriages came when expected. Musicians learned which door to use. Florence's sitting room accumulated lists sealing wax pins for place cards and the peculiar piece of useful work. She did not make the house quiet. That surprised her. Everett objected whenever she planned every minute of an evening. For the music gathering, he left 1/2 hour after supper entirely unassigned. "An empty half hour is how people begin discussing one another," Florence warned. "An empty half hour is how people discover they like one another. They may discover it according to plan." He refused. The half hour remained empty. It became the liveliest part of the evening when 2 elderly ladies began a card game. 3 young men were drawn into it, and a shy girl persuaded the pianist to play a country air instead of the planned sonata. Florence hated that Everett was right. He was gracious about his victory for nearly 11 minutes. The attraction grew in places Florence could not blame on gratitude. She liked him most when no one important was watching the same easy attention for an exhausted footman or a duchess. The same memory for which cousin hated charades, and which widow adored them. Everett in turn seemed to watch Florence most closely when she forgot to be agreeable. Once when the steward suggested seating a woman with a painful hip at the far end of the room because the place was socially convenient, Florence said, "No, she sits where she can rise without an audience." Everett, standing behind the steward, went very still. Later he said, "You are terrifying when you are reasonable. You are exhausting when you are pleased. I shall treasure that as encouragement." The music evening ended after midnight. When the last carriage had rolled away, Florence remained in the supper room, checking what had been returned to the pantry. "We are short 2 almond pastries," Miss Ingram, the steward, said. Florence frowned. She knew the number because she had counted the trays herself. Near the kitchen door, a young scullery boy stared with the guilty concentration of someone trying not to stare at all. Before she could speak, Everett wandered in with his cravat loosened and one cuff unfastened. "I confess," he announced. Florence turned. "To what the pastries? I stole them." The steward's shoulders eased almost invisibly. Florence looked from him to Everett and understood. The steward's wife had been ill for a week. Everett knew exactly where those pastries had gone, and had decided that a household servant need not explain private worry before an audience. "A marquis has no right to stolen pastry," Florence said. "Then Parliament has overlooked a grave injustice. The steward escaped with his dignity and the empty tray." Florence laughed. It came out before she could make it smaller. Warm, surprised, almost indecorous in the quiet room. Everett's answering grin softened at the edges. "There," he said. "At last. Evidence that my employment has advantages. Your employment. You cannot deny I created the criminal circumstances." He found a broken pastry left on a plate and divided it with a dessert knife. When he offered her the larger piece, Florence shook her head and took the smaller by habit. Everett looked at the two pieces, then at her. He said nothing. The next afternoon, however, Florence discovered a new instruction in the household book written in the steward's hand on entertainment nights. The host and the person directing the household were to eat before the first carriage arrived. No exception for rank. No exception for Miss Ingram. She marched to Everett's library with the book open. "You have made a rule. I am deeply ashamed. You might simply have reminded me to eat. You would have told me you were not hungry. I might have been convincing. You are never convincing when you are hungry." Her irritation dissolved. He had noticed without making a performance of it, and had included himself in the rule. At the next supper, a small plate waited in her workroom beside his. Everett arrived late, stole one slice of apple from her plate, and was struck on the knuckles with her folded guest list. He looked delighted. For an hour after the guests left, they ate the remaining broken pastries in the service passage and argued over whether any civilized gathering required charades. Florence forgot the chapel entirely. That frightened her less than she expected. The following week, the neighboring estate held a county assembly. Florence would have preferred to stay at Brackenfell, but retreating from every room that contained gossip would soon leave her no rooms at all. The assembly was crowded and overheated. Florence had just set down a cup of punch when Mrs. Gable, a broad woman with a voice trained to travel, stepped into her path. "Miss Ingram," she said, "tell me, do you often change partners in the middle of a ceremony? Or was your wedding day a special innovation?" Laughter broke from two people standing near enough to enjoy the cruelty without owning it. Florence felt the old impulse rise at once, answer gently. Rescue the woman from her own bad manners, and manners notice who needed a chair, make the evening easier for everyone except herself. Everett reached them before Florence decided whether to speak. His smile was bright enough to make half the nearby circle turn. "Mrs. Gable," he said, "Miss Ingram has already corrected my supper tables twice this month. I assure you, changing partners is the least alarming use she makes of her judgment." A few guests laughed with him now, rather than with the matron. He turned to Florence and held out his hand. "May I have this dance?" The request was public, but it was still a request. Florence looked at his hand, then at the watching faces. If she refused merely because they watched, the room would be choosing for her again. "One," she said. One. Everett agreed. The set formed. Florence danced with him, and for the first few minutes almost enjoyed the insolence of remaining visible. Everett did not speak about Lysander. He told her instead that Lord Derby had already offended 3 people with a story about a spaniel and was likely to reach 5 before supper. "You sound proud of him. I respect consistency." She laughed despite herself. Then the set ended. Everett should have bowed and returned her to the edge of the floor. Instead, as the musicians began another dance, he kept her hand and turned with easy confidence toward the new figures. Brackenfell, Florence said under her breath. "Trust me." That was the mistake. Around them the whisper changed. Florence heard it before the second figure had finished. "There, he means to claim her openly. Perhaps she wanted the brother all along." Everett's very brilliance made the story easier to believe. He was not merely dancing with the abandoned bride. He was displaying her as his answer to the county. Florence completed the dance because, stopping in the middle, would create the spectacle he was trying to defeat. By the time the final turn brought them apart, her face ached from composure. "Thank you, my lord," she said. The formality made his smile falter. For the rest of the evening, Florence made herself useful with almost punishing efficiency. She found a fan beneath a chair. She arranged a carriage for a widow who wished to leave early. She repaired a loosened ribbon with a pin from her reticule. She carried lemonade to women who had spent the last hour discussing her. Every small service gave her one more minute in which she did not have to tell Everett she was angry. Across the room, he watched the pattern become unmistakable. The more distressed Florence was, the more necessary she made herself. A toast had been planned before supper. Everett had meant to use it to turn the altar gossip into a joke, so memorable that no one would dare repeat Lysander's version without repeating Everett's wit as well. He handed the folded notes to a footman. "Burn these." The footman blinked. "My lord, or use them to light a fire. They are no longer improving civilization." When the assembly ended, Everett walked Florence to the carriage and opened the door. He did not climb in. "I will ride beside it," he said. Florence gathered her shawl around her and said nothing. At Brackenfell, Everett waited until she had stepped down. In the dark, without an audience, his voice lost all its polish. "I made you my answer to them tonight," he said. "You never offered to be my answer." Florence nearly told him it was nothing. The words came so readily that she hated them. She made herself swallow them. "You wanted to win the room," she said. "Lysander wanted to win the room. I am tired of being the thing a man uses to prove he has won." Everett took the blow without defending his intention. "Tomorrow's breakfast is mine," he said. "The callers as well. You need not come down. Do not tell them I am indisposed. I will not. Do not make my absence charming." A breath that might once have become a joke left him. "I will not." "Then tomorrow's breakfast is yours." Florence went inside. Everett remained on the drive until the door closed, then turned toward the stables. The next day, Florence stayed on the private upper terrace. At 9, she heard the first carriage. At 10, laughter rose from the morning room below. Twice she caught herself listening for a footman with some small problem only she could solve. No one came. Florence sat again. It was harder than she expected to let a household continue without her. Rest felt at first like negligence. She had spent too many years proving her place by being useful before anyone asked. By late afternoon, the quiet had ceased to feel like punishment. Everett had kept his word. He had not sent for her. He had not invented an illness to explain her absence. He had simply borne the callers the questions, and whatever small disorder came with them. When Florence went downstairs before the evening supper, she checked the steward's notes once. 2 place cards had been altered badly. A tea tray had gone to the wrong room. Lord Derby had remained 20 minutes longer than anyone wished. Nothing had collapsed. Everett stood alone by the fireplace in the drawing room, looking more tired than charming. Florence crossed to him. "I was angry last night before I was tired," she said. He turned fully toward her. She had meant to say only that much. Instead, the rest came. It was not the sight of Miss Hawthorne that hurt most. It was how quickly everyone decided my leaving must be about another man, as though I could not simply refuse what Lysander asked of me, as though a woman must be carried from one choice into the next. Everett's face changed, but he did not hurry to repair the sentence for her. "The county may go on misunderstanding," he said after a moment. "If making it understand requires another display like mine, then it may remain stupid." Florence looked at him. There was no promise to conquer the gossip, no declaration that he would make everyone respect her, only the costly possibility that the room might stay wrong and he would not use her to make himself right. The musicians began a quiet country set in the adjoining room. Florence held out her hand. "One dance." Everett glanced toward the guests, then back at her. "Does the room require it?" Then I am alarmingly unprepared. I am asking because I want it." For once, the answer robbed him of wit. He took her hand. They joined the set without announcement. There was no applause, only the next figure of the dance. Florence felt the measured pressure of his fingers through her glove, the turn of his shoulder as he gave her space, the private amusement that returned when he nearly missed a figure because he was looking at her instead of the floor. "You see," she murmured, "this is why I make lists. I had hoped desire might improve my memory. It has not. Cruel. Accurate." She smiled through the next turn. This dance belonged to no rumor. That was what made it dangerous. By the time the music ended, Florence knew she wanted Everett for reasons that had nothing to do with the chapel. She wanted the man who could brighten a room. Yes, but more than that. The man who had learned that sometimes the kinder act was to leave the room unchanged and let her choose where to stand in it. The next morning, the day before the final county ball, a letter arrived by messenger. It was from Lysander. Everett read it once in the study and handed it to Florence. Lysander was threatening to attend the final ball. He intended to publicly declare that Florence and Everett had shared a secret understanding for months before the wedding, and that Emery Hawthorne had merely been an excuse Florence used to escape her vows. The lie was clever. Everett turned Florence's refusal into proof that some other man must have decided for her. Everett threw the letter onto the desk. "I can make him a laughingstock from here to London before the first dance. I will stand on the stairs and—" "No," Florence said sharply. Everett stopped. "You will not turn my reputation into a duel of wits," Florence said. "We will divide the work. I decide the order of the evening, how Miss Hawthorne is received, and what I say. You manage the doors. If a guest insults someone under your roof, you may remove him." Everett looked at her, then folded the page on which he had begun his imagined toast. "Your words are yours. The doors are mine." "Yes," Florence said. She walked to the desk, pulled out a sheet of cream writing paper, and began to write. "Who are you inviting?" Everett asked. "Emery Hawthorne," Florence said. "Directly, not as an attachment to the Duke." The night of the final ball arrived. The Brackenfell ballroom was ablaze with 1,000 wax candles. Florence had banished all white floral arrangements. The room was decorated in warm, rich autumn colors. It was not a wedding. It was her triumph. The county arrived buzzing with the anticipated scandal. At 10 o'clock, the doors opened. Emery Hawthorne walked in alone. She wore the same rich burgundy gown she had worn in the chapel. Conversations thinned, then broke apart as people recognized her. Florence walked gracefully across the floor. She did not glare. She did not offer a fake, glittering smile. "Miss Hawthorne," Florence said, her voice clear and carrying, "I am glad you accepted my invitation." Emery looked stunned, then deeply relieved. "Thank you, Miss Ingram." The easy story of two women fighting over a duke became harder to tell. An hour later, Lysander arrived. He strode into the ballroom, flanked by two sympathetic lords. He saw Emery standing freely near the punch bowl, and he saw Florence directing the orchestra. Lysander moved to the center of the room. "Everett," he called out. The music faltered. Guests turned. "Your Grace," Everett said, stepping out from the crowd but keeping his distance. "I see you are flaunting your prize." Lysander sneered loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Are we to pretend this was not your plan all along? You seduced my bride, and she used my generosity toward Miss Hawthorne as a convenient excuse to throw herself into your arms." The insult was ugly and deliberate. Florence did not look at Everett. She stepped forward before anyone else could answer for her. "Your Grace," Florence said, her voice ringing clearly. "Let us rely on what these guests have actually witnessed. Miss Hawthorne's rooms in the East Wing were prepared 3 days before the ceremony. You stated your arrangement regarding her presence while we stood at the altar before the vows. I refused you and asked your brother for an escort. He provided it. I began paid employment in this house 2 days later. That is the sequence." She turned slightly toward the crowd. "I have nothing to hide. I simply refused to be a wife who was required to endure your choices in silence. Florence then looked directly at Emery. Miss Hawthorne, do you wish to be used as proof against me tonight? Emery's lips parted, but no answer came. Across the ballroom, Lysander looked at her. He did not speak. He did not need to. Florence remembered the East Wing rooms and allowance, the comforts that depended upon a duke's favor. Florence stopped thinking about what Emery's answer could do for her. You owe me no defense, Florence said more quietly. You need not save my reputation. Only answer for yourself if you wish to answer at all. Emery looked at Florence, then not at Lysander. Her fingers unclasped one by one. No, she said. Her voice shook, but it carried. I do not wish to be used against you. His Grace told me to remain quiet at the wedding so the new wife would not be embarrassed. She swallowed. I have been quiet for him often enough. A murmur travelled through the nearest guests. Lysander's face darkened. Emery. She flinched at her name, yet did not step back. The story he had brought into the ballroom was no longer his alone. He turned on Everett. You orchestrated this. You stole her? Everett stood perfectly still. When he answered, his wit was dry rather than theatrical. My brother Everett said, his voice bone-dry mistakes the fact that a woman left him for evidence that another man must have carried her away. A low ripple of murmurs crossed the room. Everett had made Lysander's logic ridiculous without claiming Florence as his own. Everett signaled his steward. His Grace is leaving. He has insulted a guest under my roof, which means he no longer possesses an invitation to remain. Lysander looked around. No one moved to support him. He turned on his heel and marched out to the doors. Lord Derby cleared his throat and turned from the open doors. 2 guests near him followed. Florence let that small change speak for itself. She turned to the orchestra leader. A lively country dance, if you please. The evening is far from over. She walked into the crowd, took the arm of a young, awkward cousin, and paired him with a widowed lady who loved to dance. The music swelled. Conversation rose with it, and supper resumed. It was long past midnight when the final carriage departed. The ballroom was empty except for candles burning low above the polished floor. Everett was standing near the far wall, quietly unknotting a stray ribbon from the back of a chair. He had not come to find her after Lysander left. He had not asked what the victory meant for them. Florence could have gone upstairs, taken her earned wages into spring, and allowed the county to guess forever. Nothing in the evening required her to cross the empty floor. That was precisely why she did. Florence walked toward him. She carried a small object in her gloved hand. She stopped a few feet away. She opened her hand. It was the cream wedding dance card. The first line where she had crossed out Lysander's name was still visible. You kept it, Everett said quietly. I did, Florence said. She reached into her pocket and produced the tiny silver pencil. She looked down at the card. The very last line of the evening was blank. With careful, deliberate strokes, she wrote Everett on the line. She looked up at him. At the altar I chose the man who would take me away. Tonight I am choosing the man I want to come back. Everett's breath hitched. He looked at his name on the card. He did not make a joke. He did not offer a charming deflection. I will not turn this into a promise you did not make, Everett said. If you want courtship, I want it too. Your employment remains unchanged, and tomorrow may ask its own question. I know, Florence said. She closed the distance between them. She reached up, resting her hand against his jaw. His cheek warmed beneath her glove. When Florence lifted her face, Everett kissed her. It was brief, warm, and private after a month of shared work, repaired mistakes, and laughter after the guests had gone. Hours later, the sky above County Wicklow began to turn a pale, bruised purple, signaling the dawn. Florence and Everett sat side by side on the cold stone steps outside the ballroom's terrace doors. The cool morning air smelled of damp earth and coming autumn. Between them sat a small silver plate containing a single cold almond pastry left over from the midnight supper. Florence looked at the pastry. Her old caregiving reflex flared. She picked it up, intending to hand the entire thing to Everett. She paused. She broke the pastry in half. She took a bite of her half first, savoring the sweet almond paste, before holding the other half out to him. Everett took it, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face. "I should report you to the county," Everett teased, leaning his shoulder against hers. The greatest scandal of the season, the hostess eating before the host. "You may report me if you wish," Florence said, swallowing her bite. She had earned her full wages. The steward had offered the same terms for the spring gatherings, whether or not the courtship continued. She carefully folded the cream dance card and tucked it into her glove. Everett finished his pastry and brushed the crumbs from his dark trousers. He looked at her, his eyes bright in the dawn light. "Do you suppose there will be room on your spring card for me?" Florence looked at the empty plate, then up at Everett. "You will have to earn the first dance," Florence said. Everett laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the quiet morning. Florence stood up first, brushing the crumbs from her skirt. She turned, held out her hand, and pulled him up to meet her. The end.